Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Climate Justice Pavilion for our last panel of the day, Comprehensive Multilateral Approaches to Loss and Damage. We will get started right away. So passing off to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Really, thank you for joining us today in what is going to be a really important conversation about loss and damage. My name is Manish Papna. I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'm going to take, just to give you a quick arc of what we're going to do in this hour, I'm going to take a couple of minutes to introduce the topic. We're going to have a keynote, and I'll introduce the keynote speaker in just a moment. And then we're going to have a panel discussion. And then we're going to open it up to all of you for a conversation with the audience. As part of my introduction, what I'd like to do is actually share with you an email that I received from a partner of ours who runs an organization called the Self-Employed Women's Association. This organization, SEWA, is based in the western part of India, and it works with women, cooperatives. All around about 3 million women are members of this organization, oftentimes in the poorest parts of rural India. And this email was dated May 13th of this year, 2022. Dear Manish Bhai, greetings, hope you are well and safe from the multiple risks we are all facing. We all have still not come out fully from the pandemic. The climate crisis is worsening. Currently, there is a severe heat wave with temperatures recorded at 52 degrees centigrade. Never in our history we've experienced such severe and harsh heat. The members of SEWA, the salt pan workers working in the desert in the scorching heat, they live in the desert. For these salt pan workers, it is impossible to work after 10 a.m. This reduces their working hours, directly affecting their income. The government is supplying water through tankers every alternate day, but it is stored in cement tanks in the open. The water is also hot. The food cooked also gets spoiled. The hot winds keep blowing continuously, making it unbearable. Similarly, the street vendors, construction workers, and waste collectors also are in very precarious situation. The hours of work is reduced. That directly affects their income. They suffer from heat stroke with fever, vomiting, diarrhea. For vegetable and fruit vendors, the vegetables and fruits get spoiled very quickly, suffer big losses. There is need for cool boxes to store drinking water, vegetable and fruits. The salt pan workers need protective shelters, maybe like containers. They need ORS, oral rehydration salts, black raisins, fenugreek packets to keep the members and the workers hydrated. Need for proper water supply, solar fans, solar water coolers. With regards, yours sincerely. No, climate change is happening today. We know that. It's happening all around us. These people that are suffering what they're suffering had nothing to do with the problem. This is a fundamental issue of justice, and the world is failing them, has failed them. But we need to make amends, and that's what this conversation today on loss and damage is about. We're going to start with Dana Ahmed, a youth climate activist. She is an 18-year-old Egyptian, born and raised in Abu Dhabi. She's studying at the University of Glasgow in Scotland and is writing a research paper about Egypt's road to achieving a net zero target by 2030. Dana, we're delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much. Before I begin or introduce myself, I'm going to start by reciting a Quranic verse I think being in Egypt, in the Middle East, an Islamic country, with several Islamic executives, leaders, and policymakers, it's important to remind them that protecting nature and protecting our land and heritage is a fundamental pillar of Islam. And this verse directly stresses that, and also stresses that if it's not us, the youth, who are going to be holding these executives accountable, then God will in the afterlife. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. كلوا واشربوا من رزق الله ولا تعثوا في الأرض مفسدين. صدق الله العظيم. Hello everyone. My name is Dana Ahmed. I'm a 19-year-old Egyptian youth climate advocate. I was raised in the United Arab Emirates and currently study in Scotland at the University of Glasgow, Common Law and Politics. And I'm also the founder of EcoSpectrum that is supported by Al-Ittihad newspaper by specifically Mr. Hamad Al-Kaabi and Ms. Asma Al-Fahim from Al-Ittihad. EcoSpectrum is the first mobile application movement in the world that aims to elevate climate and ocean literacy for youth on the spectrum of autism. As an Egyptian living far away from Egypt, I always felt distant from home. But what managed to keep me close to my culture and heritage is my granddad. My granddad is practically the main reason I'm here today, as he continues to inspire my work and be at the center of all my aspirations. And only a year ago today, he was diagnosed with chronic dehydration as a result of rising temperatures in Egypt, coupled with his dementia that has unfortunately caused him to be permanently paralyzed. This year, COP27, for the first time since 1995, where COP1 took place in Berlin, Germany, loss and damage has finally been incorporated into the agenda. But what seems to be a misconception prevalent in many loss and damage discussions is that the issue has just surfaced due to the increasing impact of climate change, that it has just started to have detrimental effects on people's livelihoods. That is not true. In 1991, Vanuatu has risen the issue of loss and damage and demanded accountability and financial compensation to be given to indigenous communities on the island by the developed states of whom caused the loss of land, culture, and heritage of the Vanuatuan people. And yet, more than 30 years later, we have just risen concerns around the issue of the irreversible losses and damages caused by the climate crisis on vulnerable communities. As much as I want to praise how far we've come in acknowledging such issues, the unfortunate reality that no one seems to want to admit is that we are late. We are late to saving the Pakistani people and indigenous communities in Pakistan from the flooding. 1/3 of the country is already underwater. 8 million people are already displaced. 1,730 people have already lost their lives due to the climate crisis and the flooding in Pakistan. We are late in returning the homes and the cultures that raised generations in Sohag, where my granddad was raised, because the agricultural land is no longer fertile because of the climate change impacts. And the people that have relied on that land to raise their own children were forced to abandon their homes and migrate away from that land that has served their ancestors just to be able to feed their families. We are late in helping people like my granddad not suffer from rising temperatures in the MENA region and in Egypt, that it robs them from the physical ability to move. And yet, the denial of climate refugees still exists. People continue to be forced to abandon their homes due to environmental disasters. Financial compensation has yet to be equally distributed, and we continue to deny that we are in the midst of an urgent humanitarian crisis because of climate change. Throughout my time at this conference that has started from Monday the 7th, climate finance and money has been seen to serve as the only source of compensation for the vulnerable communities suffering from loss and damage. I'm confused and angered by this, because losing your home cannot be financially compensated. Losing your culture and way of life that you've been used to since your ancestors cannot be financially compensated. Losing your loved ones due to climate change cannot be financially compensated. And the emotional sufferings that those people had to and continue to endure cannot be financially compensated. Of course, I say this when I still expect financial compensation from developed states and corporate polluters, and for them to be held accountable for these losses to territory, culture, life, and property. But yet, even that, we are failing drastically in. Because, again, many do not want to admit this, but we are so far along the impacts of loss and damage on so many vulnerable communities globally that 100 billion is no longer enough. Scientific research has proven trillions will be needed each year to meet the Paris Agreement's goal of restricting global warming to below 2.0 degrees, not even 1.5. But more than financial compensation, we want insurance. We can no longer rely on short-term resolutions such as compensating vulnerable communities through repayable loans, like the existing 74% of loss and damage financial compensation, and having the vulnerable communities of the climate crisis pay for the loss and damage caused by developed states and the bigger polluters. But what's even more frustrating is that those vulnerable communities, my community, is expected to trust the coalitions to solve a crisis that they have caused using our money. That in itself is a crisis. Fossil fuel industries need to be shut down. The Santiago Network project needs to be put forth. We need the acknowledgement and urgency of climate refugees. Industrial countries need to pay for the loss and damage caused by the climate crisis, and we will not wait until 2024 for a decision. Climate justice cannot exist without empathy and compassion for communities that suffer the most from the inaction by our policymakers, even ones you are not part of. And with that, we must recognize the communities that are not represented here at COP27 today and have lacked representation throughout time in significant climate negotiations and discussions, despite it directly being determinant of their lives and futures. One of these communities are youth on the spectrum of autism. According to the National Autistic Society, people with autism are 3 times more likely to be victims of abuse or aggression. The increase in societal stress generated because of climate change works as a stressor, aggravating the risk of violence suffered by this group. The intensity of sensory crisis in people with ASD directly impacts their quality of life, bringing negative results in social interaction and communication. This adversity in socialization results in difficulties in escaping or evacuating intense environmental disasters, which, as we know, are more common than ever today, such as hurricanes, floods, and cyclones, which thus generates disproportionately higher rates of morbidity and mortality in people on the autism spectrum. The lack of autistic-friendly educational resources, coupled with the global financial inefficiency to the right to education for those on the spectrum, has generated a high dropout rate in children and young people with autism, limiting access to knowledge, resources, and services. This deprives them of the tools they need to empower and respond effectively to environmental changes, and is thus a reason as to why 85% of people on the spectrum have no opportunities in the labor market and therefore are more susceptible to living in poverty and are thus more exposed to the impact of loss and damage. During the stage of shutdown, a common type of crisis that occurs once people on the spectrum get sensory overload as a result of global warming and the rising temperatures, difficulty of answering or responding to any type of communication often follows. With communities such as the autistic community that suffer such severe impacts that it limits their ability to communicate their sufferings from climate change, it is our role as the youth, a community that knows what it feels to be neglected and pushed aside in climate conversations, to support other vulnerable communities too. To be in this conference is a privilege, and we must all recognize that. We must also appreciate our exposure to resources that make us capable of understanding at least most of climate negotiations and have the opportunity to intervene and express our thoughts, concerns, and opinions, even if most go unheard. Youth on the spectrum do not have that. And current climate and ocean conservation resources are not accessible for them, yet. What we aim to do with EcoSpectrum is increase awareness, inclusion, and representation of the community in climate negotiations, as well as equip them with resources that suit their needs and elevate their understanding of climate and ocean issues, a cause that directly impacts their health and well-being. We have a responsibility to care and protect neurodivergent and youth with disabilities, regardless of whether we are part of their communities or not. Which is why I hope with EcoSpectrum, it acts as a seed that forces a domino effect in the representation of vulnerable communities that are not our own and need their voices and stories to be heard. The lack of climate education that is accessible for neurodivergent youth risks the loss of an entire community. Climate education needs to be incorporated into national and local curriculums with information and knowledge that is up to date and accurately represents current concerns of vulnerable communities within the climate justice and action movement with regards to loss and damage, whilst integrating tools and methods that are inclusive of needs of youth on the spectrum. We cannot continue being late again. We cannot afford the loss of another community again. If this COP is truly, as it says, the COP of implementation, we need to force leaders, heads of state, and executive policymakers to act now in protecting vulnerable communities from loss and damage. Everyone, please, act now. Shukran jiddan, thank you.
Thank you very much. Inspiring, insightful, a real call to action. And we're going to pick up on a lot of the themes that you raised in this discussion with our two panelists. Let me introduce them. We have Professor Salim Hook, who is the director of the International Center for Climate and Development, originally from Bangladesh, and someone I've known for 15 years, working. I remember when, back in the Paris Agreement, I was mentioning this to him, when he was sitting in a similar type of pavilion focused on adaptation and loss and damage, and he was almost alone, to be honest, talking about loss and damage. And to see what that vision and the agenda and what it has become today, it's a privilege to have you here. And then my friend Liana, who has been the director of the, and I can never pronounce it, the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, but someone I've known for about 20 years and has been focused on really the progressive use or the use of progressive philanthropy to profoundly reform the international trade and financial system, and someone who has been deeply engaged on gender and climate issues for much of that time. So we're delighted to have both of you here. Let me start with a question for both of you. You know, loss and damage was a very different conversation in the 1990s, in 2015, even last year, and now this year. Tell us a little bit about how you have seen the conversation evolve and what you see moving forward.
Thank you very much, Manish, and good evening to everybody. So we are here now in Sharm el-Sheikh at the 27th Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention. And I happen to be one of the few people who's been to all 27. This is my 27th, all right? But this is different. This may be the 27th Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention, but it is the first Conference of Parties of the new era of impacts of climate change happening and getting worse every year from now on, all right? This is the first time we are meeting when the impacts of human-induced climate change are happening already. Not something we're anticipating, preparing for, trying to avoid. We've lost that game altogether. It's now happening. And so the issue of loss and damage isn't so much the discussion here in the negotiations. It's the reality on the ground. It's the floods in Pakistan, the floods in Nigeria, the hurricane in Florida. Ian and then Nicole hit people in Florida. They lost their homes. That's loss and damage, and I feel for them. And as Dana says, you know, the mental impact of this doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. It hits you, and you feel the psychological impact. In the climate change jargon, we call that non-economic loss and damage, but I prefer to call it human and ecosystem loss and damage, which is much more valuable than money. She's quite right. You know, money cannot compensate for that. We get fixated on funding and finance, but that isn't the main point. The main point is our humanity, our willingness to see each other as human beings and take responsibility. So I'd like to do, if you don't mind, a quick experiment. Can I just, for the audience here, if you wouldn't mind, raising your hand if you already believe that loss and damage is happening? Great. Can you now raise your hand if you're an American citizen? Excellent. So I'm now going to address you, the American citizens in the audience, all right? Because it's your representative here who is blocking things, all right? Mr. Kerry is the person who's blocking things. Mr. Biden came here, didn't mention this at all right? You have to change their minds. And the way to change their minds is to get them out of this mindset that Mr. Kerry has. It's a fixation that we are claiming liability and compensation. We're not. We're asking for humanity, acceptance of responsibility, and then a sense of solidarity to the victims of the impacts of climate change. Start with that. We're not invoking liability and compensation. You know, when we had the agenda fight here to get it on the agenda, the United States added a footnote to an agenda item, never heard of this before, that says this cannot be used for liability and compensation when we didn't even ask for that, all right? And so the way they're treating us is, you know, we say we're not asking for liability and compensation, but they say, you're thinking about it, and I don't want you to think about it, all right? I forbid you to think about liability and compensation, let alone say it. We have to change their minds, and I hope you guys can help us change it. Thank you.
I was just saying, I don't think I can add to that much, rather than picking up, obviously, the responsibility. And Dana mentioned that as well. I think she's very right. It's a privilege for us to be here. Many, many people can't be here, but it's also a responsibility. And the responsibility is to speak up for those that can't be here, to raise the issues, to not shy away in the political rooms and the negotiation rooms in the corridor, also of confronting. And I mean, when we go into some of the weeds of the discussion, we see that the waiting game is played again, right? Dana mentioned that it took a long, long time, the 40 years that it was originally raised, and now 17 plus years to get it back on the agenda. And here, the political game that is being played is one of waiting again, of saying we have to be clear of what loss and damage is. We need to really make sure that we understand it properly. We should probably have more studies. We should probably have more discussions. We need to have clearer differentiations. All of that has happened over the past 10 plus years in multiple fora there. The time for talking and delaying is over. We need a decision here at COP27, and we don't need a decision to have a decision maybe in 2 or 3 years without knowing what the outcome of that decision is. But we need very clearly what everybody is crying out. We need the loss and damage finance facility approved here. That doesn't mean that it's going to be able to deliver funding right away, but it sets the signal that the developed country and the US has to take the lead if it wants to claim the leadership in international climate diplomacy. It means that developed countries are serious about tackling the issue, taking on the responsibility. And they are all experiencing loss and damage in their own countries already. In Germany, the country where I was born, which you can hear on my accent, Last year, when we had those really horrendous floods in the Ahrtal, Germany, the government of Germany, came forward and pulled together within a very short time a 30 billion compensation fund for German citizens. And that is right, it should be compensated. But then you can't do it at home and deny it for victims of loss and damage internationally, and particularly in the developed world, where you don't have maybe a state that has the fiscal space, that has the financial strengths that most of the developed countries have.
So really, so many important themes that were raised there. You know, the United States, solidarity between the rich world and the rest of the world. We're at, it's, what day is today? Tuesday? Tuesday, on the second week of the COP. The very active conversations around what we're actually going to get on loss and damage. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the state of play in the negotiations, what we need to strive for by the end of this COP, and what you'd like to see that is ambitious but plausible by COP28. Salim, do you want to start? And
Thank you very much. So I'll tell you what I'm looking for. Okay, I'm looking for Friday and not Saturday, because they don't finish on time. They're going to push us from the official ending on Friday into Saturday. They did that last year in Glasgow. The year before that, or 2 years before that in Madrid, they didn't push us to Saturday, they pushed us to Sunday. All right, 2 extra days. And it's a deliberate tactic, by the way, because they get rid of all the developing countries who can't afford to stay the extra days. I expect by the end of Sharm el-Sheikh COP27, all countries to agree to establish the Sharm el-Sheikh Finance Facility for Loss and Damage. That's just one sentence. All countries agree to that one sentence, all right? Then, next year in COP28, we have 12 months to work on all the questions they're asking us right now. Where's money going to come from? Who's going to manage the money? Who's going to get the money? Unless we have answers to all these questions, we won't agree to anything. I say you agree to it now, and we'll answer the questions between now and COP28. And in COP28, you come back and you get a set of options on what you can do to deal with the problem and set up the facility. They're objecting to the word facility, all right? What does it mean? It can mean anything. That's why I like the word. It can mean whatever you like it to mean. We work out what it means COP28, but you agree on the facility here, all right? Doesn't mean anything, but it means something, all right? So why can't you agree to it? That's what I want to see. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go a little bit more techno-geek here. And I say I want to see the Sharm el-Sheikh Loss and Damage Finance Facility, but I want a clear commitment that this is under the funding mechanism of the UNFCCC, and that it is an operating entity of the funding mechanism of the UNFCCC. Now this is a mouthful. What does it mean? It means actually that you would put the Sharm el-Sheikh Loss and Damage Finance Facility at an equal footing and with similar procedures like you have for the Green Climate Fund and for the Global Environment Facility. And this is very important because that would anchor financially accountability and responsibility, as well as guidance from the COP and CMA back to the financial mechanism for loss and damage under the convention. This is really crucial. I know there are a lot of approaches that being put forward, but in order to have a facility that is guided by the core principles of the Framework Convention, particularly CBDR, which is essentially the polluter pays, even without talking about compensation and reparation, this is still the predominant principle by which loss and damage financing to address loss and damage should be guided. That is only possible and can only be secured, as well as the eligibility of all developing countries, when you put it as part of the financing mechanism of the UNFCCC. So that's what I would like to see. Dana as well?
For me, I'd like to see the Santiago. Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Okay. For me, I'd like to see the Santiago framework project being put forth and being also part of the Sharm el-Sheikh financial facility that is going to be put forward. And yes, having it on the same footing as other procedures that have been put forth by the UNFCCC is going to guarantee that financial compensation is going to be equally distributed between states. And I think I stressed that also in my keynote, we do not want repayable loans. We do not want to have loans on developing states that are paying for something that they did not cause. We need the developed states to take full accountability for their actions and full accountability for what they have caused, the loss of territory, the loss of property, the loss of culture and heritage, the loss of homes to the people in developing states. And yeah.
No, very, very much agree. I mean, we know that we need to minimize further loss and damage, so there must be a unwavering commitment to no more than 1.5. We got to continue to focus on mitigation, but we also know impacts are happening now, and compensation is needed. Loss and damage is needed, and it is significant. So a question for all of you: how would you? The rich world will often say, "We just don't have the money." What is your response to that? There is both a kind of a moral response, but there's also then a practical response. And I'd welcome responses in both veins.
This one's working all right. Thank you. Yeah, I seem to be the first with the mic. So I dispute the fact that there is no money, all right? Just look at the excessive profits being made by the fossil fuel companies right now. The world is going through a crisis, and their profits are trebling, quadrupling into the hundreds of billions of dollars into the stratosphere, something they've never had before. We are suffering with the energy crisis. They are making money at a phenomenal rate. Just claw back some of that and put it into a fund here. And the practical, every country that has one of these companies just does it. They're talking about, windfall taxes for their domestic use. Take a windfall tax and put it into a fund here. The United States with Exxon, with Chevron, Saudi Arabia with Aramco, Netherlands with Shell. It's a handful of companies, take $1 billion off each of them, and they won't even notice, and put it into a fund here. And it can be done tomorrow. The governments can take that money and put it into a fund here if they wanted to, and if you can make them do it.
Yes, and maybe to add, we also shouldn't forget, and I think it's crucially important, that we actually have a multitude of fossil fuel subsidies, the amount of fossil fuel subsidies, than what the developed country jointly mobilized and delivered as climate finance per year. So this is happening in developed countries. It is happening continued at the same time as those companies are reaping the windfall profits that Salim is talking about. The developed world, G20, G7, others have many, many years ago committed to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. I seem to remember, wasn't that the G20 in 2009 in Pittsburgh, where that firm commitment was made? We haven't seen that. As a matter of fact, it seems that some of the fossil fuel subsidies are actually rising. And I want to bring up, and that's another important point, we are in an era of loss and damage. Unfortunately, we are also in an era of continued warfare and militarization. Just a couple of days of military action would probably fund the loss and damage finance facility for years to come. And I think we really need to start being honest about the priorities that are set by developed countries for funding certain things and supporting certain things and not supporting others. And this is the time to support loss and damage, and this is the time to show responsibility and leadership. And if we can't get it here at COP27, well, I don't know. We have to get it here at COP27.
So what you're saying is,
I was just going to say this from a moral perspective. We have long been bargaining with people's lives and ignoring that developing states, indigenous communities, and communities that, again, are not represented here at COP are dying because of the lack of inaction. And we need to stop doing that. We need to stop treating people's lives as though they are tokens. We need to stop sending Western ideals and colonialization to indigenous communities and leading their projects. They know how to lead their own land. They know how to take care of their own selves. And if they are communicating to us, which they have constantly been, that they need help and they need support, then our job as youth here is to force executives and leaders of developed states and those fossil fuel industries to be held accountable for it, and to serve and to pay compensation, financial compensation, and also human compensation as well. This is part of their responsibility, this is part of their accountability, and if we cannot recognize that, then we continue again to bargain with people's lives.
So we should, a lot of money is being spent on things that may be less important. We should stop providing funding to the very companies, directly and indirectly, that are creating the problem. And they're making such excess profits right now that perhaps some of those profits can be used to support what radical ideas, right? That this should be still a debate, right? One more question to all of you, and then I want to open this up. So think about a couple of questions you might want to ask the panel. We're going to turn to the audience in just a moment. And Donna kind of raised this very, very thoughtfully. What are the issues that we're not talking about in this convention related to this topic that deserve more attention?
I think mainly education. It's one of the most topics that, although are discussed, they're discussed on very surface level and they're discussed in a very shallow manner. And especially they're not discussed on terms of how can we provide accessible education to vulnerable communities that do not have access to education or do not have access to the educational climate resources that they need to have access to. And that can be dissected in so many different ways. It can be the language barrier, which I think is not in terms of what language I speak and what language the person in front of me speaks. It's the fact that the language and the terms that are used in the UNFCCC articles and in the UNFCCC documents and those reports are just hard to understand. And if we are the youth who are going to be taking over tomorrow and we are the youth who are leading the future, then why should we be put in a position where we cannot understand what the language is of those world leaders and of those executives? It's not fair. And again, this is bargaining with people's lives. We have the right to understand. We have the right to be educated. And even more than that, vulnerable communities and people who are actually suffering from the loss and damage today have the right to be educated about why they are suffering. We've got communities like the autistic community that has absolutely no educational foundation that supports their environmental awareness or supports their environmental education. That is a huge issue because they are at the front line of the climate crisis. And if there's anyone that's going to be suffering from loss and damage among many other communities, they are at the front line of the crisis. Because they deal with sensory processing difficulties because of global warming, that they might get to a point in meltdown or in the stage of burnout that they might get permanently paralyzed. That is a huge deal that no one wants to recognize and no one wants to mitigate action for. Or implement any rules that try to support that, even though they are a huge part of our community. It is our responsibility to protect them.
Can I just come in? I want to say I've been at not as many COPs as some Salim has. It's going to be hard to top, but I have been to my fair share. And one of the things that deeply, again and again, disturbs me is that we are talking about the solution and the processes by a focus on the means, like on finance, like on technology, and we are forgetting the human foundation of it all. So I want to say the loss and damage crisis is fundamentally a human rights crisis, and we cannot have climate justice without human rights, and I want to say also gender justice. And I think bringing in the gender dimension is really, really crucial here. And unfortunately, in the discussion, and it almost doesn't matter which of the discussion strengths you look at, whether it's the discourse about finance, whether it's the discourse about loss and damage, in the negotiation, the human rights framing does not matter. Right. And that is despite the fact that in the Paris Agreement, we have a very strong preambular section that points out that human rights is actually the foundations and has to be the lens through which we see all of our actions. And you might see that I have here that nice little red lanyard, and some people are wearing it. If you see somebody who wears that, ask them if they can spare one for you, wear it proudly, because that reminds us that we have to put human rights front and center in every discussion here, but particularly for loss and damage.
Excellent, great. So just picking up on Liane's excellent point, let me just also point out that we are sitting in the climate justice pavilion, and I congratulate you for setting it up. But I'll give you a little bit of a niggle that's a personal niggle here. I don't like the word climate justice. I prefer to use the term climate injustice, because climate justice is like an ideal that you may or may not achieve. But climate justice is something you see. It's happening, and you have to do something about it. And that's what we're talking about here. People are losing their lives caused by other people, all right? We, all of us here, have a carbon footprint higher than global average. We therefore belong in the polluter category. The people who are suffering the impacts of climate change have a carbon footprint tiny, but they're suffering the impacts that we are causing, all right? We have to take moral responsibility for causing a problem, and therefore saying, I need to do something. I need to do something to help them. And it's not money, it's humanity, it's empathy. We need to be reaching out to them and saying we want to help. And that's really what I'm appealing to you. The one other thing I'd add in terms of what's missing is that we discussed the issue of economic versus non-economic loss and damage, but there's another diversion or dichotomy in the loss and damage discussion between rapid onset events and slow onset events, all right? So rapid onset events are
floods, cyclones, hurricanes, heat waves, wildfires. And slow onset events are things like sea level rise. All right? Now, sea level rise, and I'll give you a concrete example. I live in Bangladesh. We're a very low-lying deltaic country. The lowest part of our country is almost already becoming salinized by sea level rise. And every single day, in the order of 2,000 to 3,000 people are losing their livelihoods in the coastal zone and taking a bus or a boat or a train and ending up in the slums of Dhaka city, the capital. The capital, Dhaka city, is the fastest growing megacity in the whole world. Now, when there's a flood or a cyclone, we know it's happening. We watch it on television, the relief goes. But these people are coming to Dhaka, nobody knows who they are. I don't know who they are, the government doesn't know who they are, the Red Cross doesn't know who they are, but they are climate migrants, they are climate refugees. And that, in fact, in the UNFCCC, we're not even allowed to use those words. The word climate refugee, banned. The word climate migrant, banned. What are they? They're displacement because of human-induced climate change. You have to use a mouthful to explain a simple human phenomenon. And we need to correct that soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes. I would love to open up this conversation, take a few reflections, questions, comments from the audience, and then we'll come back to the panel for a final round. Who would like to? So, how do we make this? Do we have an extra? Should we invite them up, or or just stand up maybe? And
Yeah, so stand up, come up here, stand on the blue X so everyone can see you who's joining on the live stream, and then you can ask your question.
All right, hello everyone. First of all, thank you guys so much for your perspectives. I really appreciated them. And I wanted to start out my question by saying I fully support loss and damage funding and implementation at the UNFCCC level. I guess I wanted to address the point of like the hesitation of some of the bigger countries like the US, my country, and specifically maybe Envoy Kerry blocking the measure, because I think one of the biggest hesitations is how it will be implemented and maybe the more logistical question of how it will actually be implemented. And one of the things I've been grappling with loss and damage is the questions of to what extent, how do you determine to what extent something is caused by climate change, given that there's such a big range of effects, even coming to viruses and pandemics. How do you quantify those losses and damages, and how do you determine who is responsible for causing a pandemic that might be maybe made more likely by climate change? All these tough logistical questions that follow once you maybe implement a finance facility. That's my question.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to take 2 or 3, if that's okay, and then come back to the panel. I think there was a question there. I just say, come in. I think there's a. There we go.
Hi, thank you so much for the amazing panel so far. So my question is related to the role of the private sector. So as you know, John Kerry announced the First Movers Coalition, and then Global Shield just happened. And clearly, like, if these larger countries are saying that they're politically constrained, this might be, at least in the short term, the only thing that we have. And so I'm wondering what you think the role of the private sector should be in financing all of these possible projects, which have their own implications. There are so many problems with offsets, and whether you think it is possible to create accountability measures for the private sector, whether that's through an official finance facility or through these voluntary commitments.
Wonderful. Really good. Let's take 1 or 2 more questions. I'll go. Please, all 3 of you, why don't you come up, because we'll do 1 round of 3 more questions, please. Would you also please, come up and introduce yourself and.
Hi, I'm Brandon Levy of the Sustainable Ocean Alliance. I work closely with Dana, and thank you for the wonderful and informative panel. I had a question in regards to the role of multilateral development banks and central banks, and even the proposal put forth by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, around special drawing rights. Do you see that as a promising way to get financing to the global south and developing nations around loss and damage? Thank you.
Great. So another important question on finance in the Bridgetown initiative, which I think Liana will jump into in a moment, or I'm happy to as well.
Hello. I don't know whether mine will be put. Yeah. Look. I don't know whether mine will be put forth as a question or a comment or an observation, whichever it is. But the position that makes it look like the United States, particularly Kerry, is not in support of loss and damage is quite blurry, because I think it is a political position that is needed to be taken to actually draw the attention of certain countries to get them to also respond to loss and damage. If you should look at it critically, it looks like the Paris Agreement was actually brought to life with the United States virtually leading it. And there are other countries that also have to help. That's one thing. We're talking about loss and damage, and right behind it we have the V20 and some other CVF and other instruments pulling strings, and Germany just launched the Global Shield. And we have the Global Shield. Germany has promised some amount of money to come through to be fast, responsive, fluid money actually going to these areas. The question is this: if the United States should decide to say that I am supporting loss and damage, hopefully, openly, what is actually the convincing power of these vulnerable states once you've actually got United States saying that we're supporting loss and damage? Russia can go to sleep. South Africa can go to sleep. China can go to sleep. And this is what we are trying to push. This COP is together for implementation. And so if we would single out a country to actually lead the course, then we're going to actually fail at even this COP.
Thank you very much. One more question, and then we're going to have very brief responses.
Thank you. I'll be very fast. My name is Kate. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley, and I'm doing research and documenting what have the loss and damages of glacier retreat been in the Andes Mountains. So I first loss and damage of glacier retreat in the Andes Mountains. So I wanted to underline the first question and ask really specifically, what can we do as young people, as students, as researchers to add to that scientific basis, to really work in partnership with communities, to build networks, to be part of that movement, to show all the evidence there is from indigenous knowledge, from research, from all these places. And then I also wanted to ask what role you see for climate litigation as another way to facilitate transfer of resources from fossil fuel companies in particular to communities. We've seen a couple cases of this already, including in the Andes Mountains in Peru. But kind of what is the timeline of that? What else can we do to make that, to hasten that, to make that a more powerful kind of mechanism as well? So thank you all so much.
Great. So 5 themes: science and attribution, private finance, MDB reform / Bridgetown, political coalitions, and the last one. So
I'll do one. I'll take the scientific attribution question. Okay, so I'll put on my scientific hat. I've been a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for many years, Working Group 2. And it's a legitimate question, or it was a legitimate question, of how much of a given disaster can be attributed to the fact that global temperature is above 1.1 degrees. It's no longer a legitimate question, okay? The 6th assessment report of the IPCC, Working Group 1, for the very first time, has given unequivocal evidence that impacts that can be attributed to the global temperature rise already above 1.1 degree are happening, scientifically provable. Then you got Working Group 2 report that has hundreds of examples of climate change impacts that can be attributable to human-induced climate change. Now, we must distinguish here between rapid onset events that are not caused by climate change, hurricanes, cyclones, wildfires, floods. They happen naturally. They used to happen before climate change. They're getting exacerbated because of climate change. Okay, so there's a subset of the scientific community who are attribution scientists, right? The attribution scientists had a hard time attributing in the past because all the models are linear models to 2100, but they don't do the zigzag, the variabilities calculations very well. But now, the
We said time is up.
Time is up, yes. Right. So the attribution scientists can now very quickly attribute the additional impact that is due to human-induced climate change. So the Pakistan floods, for example, 50% in addition for climate change. Hurricane Ian in Florida, 30% more, particularly the flooding that was caused by the rain, okay? So the attributions of how much of this damage was due to human-induced climate change can now be done. And so if you take all the damage that, let's take Hurricane Ian in Florida, $60 billion, 30% of that is human-induced climate change, all right? 70% isn't. We can do those calculations now. They're viable, doable, very reliable.
I think you said everything. So I have nothing to add.
Okay, so I'm going to come in briefly, and actually I would invite Manish as well, who is a wonderful expert, to maybe tackle one of them himself. But I want to come in briefly, at least on the Bridgetown Initiative, the question on the role of the MDBs and the central banks, which I think is a crucial one. Because again, addressing loss and damage is not just a matter of like a specific sector, but it's basically a whole of society effort, and it's a whole of society effort in all countries that needs to be integrated in the broader understanding of a whole of society attention to climate change and acting to climate change, and that's both in developed and in developing countries. Now the MDBs. Let's put it this way. I have a special beef with MDBs because they want to have it both ways. And I have a problem with that. They continue to fund very many climate harming projects and approaches, including policy approaches, but they are also touting themselves to be one of the largest providers of multilateral climate finance. Collectively, they are actually the largest provider of multilateral climate finance. And you can't have it both ways. You need consistency within the institutions, and particularly in terms of their climate responsiveness, in terms of integrating climate in all of their policy setting, the policy advice that they are giving, including the lending approaches. They have not been consistent. And so what the Bridgetown Initiative is actually pointing out is that we need a reform of the entire financial system, with the IMF paying much more attention. That's where the special drawing rights come in. Which actually means that we are reducing the liquidity problem that many developing countries have by basically giving liquidity that developed countries have plenty in the form of the special drawing rights that they are usually not using. And so by them absorbing the costs of putting the special drawing rights actually for use in developing countries. And that's actually not a new idea. That has been around, and Salim and others who have been around the climate finance block a couple of times will remember that this has come up in 2008 and 2009 as one of the innovative financing innovative sources of financing. And I'm actually very glad that we are coming back to that and not just talking about philanthropic sources or high net worth individuals again as innovative sources. We need to talk about taxes, tax systems, we need about regulatory systems, and that includes central banks and regulating the financial sector to do its part. And there, I think, is also where the responsibility of the private sector comes in, particularly the private sector that is part of the financial sector. They can be part of a certain segment of the solution. I mean, insurance is brought up quite a bit, and they have a role there, but they are certainly not all of the solution, and in particularly insurance is just a little piece of the overall picture and not the solution. And this is also why the Global Shield, while an interesting initiative and good speed, cannot be the comprehensive solution that we need for addressing financing on loss and damage.
Great. We're going to close in just a minute. I'm going to ask each of you in a sentence that is short.
Can you hear me? Okay. Just two small things. On MDB reform, incredibly important. We need to find the political will to move that forward. Private finance is going to be needed. We're going to need to define the rules very carefully about how to tap private finance for these types of issues. Just want to close with asking each of them in a tweet style sentence to find a message to the group here. Maybe I'll start.
So I'm not very good at tweets, but again, I would just bring it back to what I said earlier. It's an issue of addressing climate injustice and ensuring that we do it in a way that is gender responsive, that takes the rights of indigenous people, of people with disabilities, of local community into account. It has to start and end with people.
So my comment for everybody here, and particularly aimed at young people, which I give regularly, is as of now, your citizenship of planet Earth supersedes your citizenship of your country or the place that you live. You are a citizen of the planet, and we are dealing with a planetary scale problem. So you need to take your planetary citizenship and responsibility into account and behave accordingly. And then the other citizenships become secondary in dealing with this problem. Thank you.
Hello. I think with being here at COP27 and being merged with so many different cultures and so many different people, we have to, again, be compassionate and be empathetic of people's experiences, people's backgrounds. And with that, we have to act in order to help those communities. We have to support these communities in any way we can. I believe that every single one of us can possibly provide something to support. It doesn't have to be a project. It doesn't have to be a whole nother initiative. We just have to talk about it. We have to learn. With us being at this conference today, I find it hard to believe that we don't have accessibility, or we are not equipped with the right resources, or we are not educated about this. I believe that when we are equipped with those resources, ignorance is a mere choice.